Are you looking for Horace? Horace Patch? Well, he used to be here, but we moved him over to the new cemetery, Oakwood, and that's where he is now, right next to his dear mother, me. Well, it's a good thing that they did that, though, because I would have haunted them until they died, and then I would have just reeled them out until all eternity was done. So, I would like to talk about his funeral. He had such a wonderful funeral. Horace was part of Company C, which was the 16th Wisconsin, during the Battle of the Rebellion. Are you familiar with that at all? I think nowadays you people call it the Civil War, but that's where he was, and he got wounded in April of 1862 in his shoulder at the Battle of Shiloh. They moved him down to Corinth, Mississippi, which had a camp hospital there, and in June 1862 he died, not from his wounds, but from diarrhea. It is just amazing how many of our brave young men died of their illness rather than the wounds. Well, one of his people in his company sent us a letter and notified us of his death. And then they gave us a detailed map of how to get there and find his body. Well, it took a long time. Captain Ordway had died, and his body was returned to Beaver Dam in 2 weeks' time. But not our poor Horace. He died in June, so bringing a body up here in the summer was not a very good task. We had to wait 6 months. And let me tell you, those 6 months, I sobbed, I raged, I screamed. I did everything underneath the sun just to get those people going down south to get that body. And finally in December, they did that, and they brought him back. And they had to even go through a war zone to get his body. It came back, and it was the best Christmas present I ever got because it came in December. But anyway, I was going to tell you about his funeral. Oh, he had one of the biggest funerals ever. Oh, this wind is terrible. He had one of these biggest funerals ever. First of all, it was started out by the Beaver Dam Coronet Band. Is that still around? Do you still have that? Maybe not. But anyway, behind it was the Stars and Stripes. And then behind that were 50 uniformed soldiers that had come back from the war. And they marched with their weapons and everything, and their uniforms. After that came the 6 pallbearers, and then came the wagon with his casket in it. And it was wrapped in a flag, and it had an evergreen cross on it, and his hat, and his picture, and his sword, and his belt. And we were just... After that came the Reverend Wright. And then after that, it was 6 military pallbearers. After that, the Beaver Dam mayor, the city council, members of the city crew, all wearing their badges of service. And then a lot of the people from around the city came as well. It was just amazing. After the burial service, the 50 uniformed soldiers shot 3 volleys into the air, and all the birds in Beaver Dam flew out of the trees in honor of my Horace. Oh, that was 160 years ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday.
Are you folks here to see my Billy? I'm his fiance, Rosie. He and I were set to be married when the War of the States broke out. Do you see the flag on the stone? On August 15th of 1862, Billy enrolled in the Company K of the 29th Wisconsin Infantry and served under General Grant. He promised me he'd come home. In November of 1862, Grant launched an attack against Vicksburg from the north. Come December, from the Mississippi, he was joined by Sherman and 50 ships carrying 300,000 more troops. He sent me letters over the year, starting with this. Dearest Rosie, what fights I've seen. Vicksburg's rebel defenders, 15,000 strong, gave Sherman a bloody nose at Chickasaw Bluff on December 29th, and again at Haynes Bluff on New Year's Eve. Not much celebrating that night. We were no closer to taking Vicksburg, and it being winter, we were forced to retreat back here to Memphis, where all 103,000 of us were turned loose to live off the land. Pickings sure were slim, and I've eaten things it's hard to consider food. I have a hankering for your apple pie, Rosie. Have one ready for me when I get home, will you? My next letter came in the spring and read, My lovely Rose, I'm back in Mississippi again. Sherman's troops are attempting to dig a canal across an oxbow bend in the river to divert it past Vicksburg, and Grant has put us to work digging a second canal. Have you ever tried to shovel mud? It's cold, wet, back-breaking work, and I doubt I'll dry out much before May. While we dig, Federal ships are running south past the Vicksburg batteries. As a prank, we released an old coal barge in the dead of night. As it drifted downriver, it drew fire from the batteries and panicked a troop of Rebs, cavalrymen who were guarding the captured Federal ship, and they scuttled it. That sure lifted our spirits. And this was my last. My love, I'm writing this letter from a hospital ship below Vicksburg. Now don't you fret. I was wounded, but I'll be better soon, and then I'll come home to you. Grant took us south of Vicksburg while Sherman attacked from the north. We were victorious at Raymond on May 12th, and at Jackson on the 14th. We marched west, and on May 16th at Champion Hill I was wounded. While I laid on this ship and listened, a land of assault of Vicksburg began. By the end of the month, 30,000 defenders were under siege, with 70,000 Union troops on land and with gunboats on the river. I could hear the shelling go on non-stop, day and night. Not that I have been able to sleep. I believe I've lost more blood to the mosquitoes than from my wounds. I thought while digging that mud I'd never be warm again, but I'd gladly lay down in it right now to escape this heat. When I get back to you, I'm going to take you in my arms and never let you go. William passed on June 20th on that hospital ship, missing by mere days the fall of Vicksburg on July 4th. It split the Confederacy in two, and together with Gettysburg marked the beginning of the end. I take great pride in knowing that Billy played some small part in bringing an end to the Civil War.
Was that I need to talk about being Mrs. Burr. And I had a horrible thing happen to me. I died. And the dam went out. And it took out 2 bridges. And the cemetery was on one side of the river. And I was on the other, and they couldn't get my coffin across to bury me. Now that's a sad, sad thing to do. Just a horrible thing to do, and I couldn't. I've never been late for anything in my life. Never. And I was late for my own funeral, but it couldn't be helped. It took out 2 bridges, and it took out the dam. That dam wasn't very well built. It was dirt and some sticks. And it did the job until the force of the water pushed it over. And then, boom, out went the bridge on Madison Street and the bridge on Center Street. And both of those were just about where those bridges are today. And there was my coffin. And the man that was supposed to bring me here to bury me couldn't, because he couldn't get me across the river. Now, come on, how many people can't get to their own funeral? and are late. Think about it. Probably me. Pick me, I'm the winner on that one. Finally, at the end of the day, they had somebody rowing a boat back and forth from one side of Beaver Dam to the other. And it got to be my turn. So Mr. Burgess brought me over. And they brought me up here and they buried me. And you know what? When he got home, he got a really big surprise because his wife was pregnant. She had a baby boy while he was out trying to get me buried. So he got a nice, nice present. I got stuck in the ground.
Hello, I'm Hasseltine Dunton. You can call me Hass. I wonder if you could help me out. I wonder if you can still read this inscription on here yet. This one here, it actually says here, I think, this is in sacred memory, to the sacred memory of Hasseltine Dunton, their son, Union soldier of the 14th, let's see, I don't know, Union soldier of the War of the Rebellion, 1840 to 1865, Company K, that was the 14th Regiment, Wisconsin Volunteers. Basically it's saying, I'm not here. So I enlisted in 1862, and shortly after, 2 months later, I got wounded at Corinth, and it wasn't too bad. I recovered, but I continued fighting until I fell at Tupelo, Mississippi, and that is where my body lies. So after talking to Bill Gordon over on the east side over here and John Riley, I am sure glad that I died in battle, because I sure didn't want to get sent to that hell they called Andersonville prison, where, you know, to rot to death, basically. So Andersonville was at Fort Sumter, Georgia, and that was the largest Confederate prison. And it was nothing more than a stockade that was like 26 acres with a small creek running through it. And it was built there, I think it was 18 months before the end of the war. And it was built to house 10,000 men, but at its most, the highest capacity, there was 32,000 there. So of the 45,000 that were imprisoned there, 13,000 died of starvation, contamination, oh, what else here? Lack of water and shelter. So the only water that they had was a small creek going through the stockade, and that was kind of befouled with human waste, so not too healthy. And if you were lucky, you were able to put rig something up, a ragged tent for a shelter. If not, you dug a burrow in the ground like an animal. So, and there was a lot of rats around there. It was just infested with rats. So if you're real lucky, you were able to catch one, you had something to eat, because there really was nothing much there for anybody to eat. So, not real great living conditions in that. So, I don't know if you ever heard of the word deadline. You know, there's it has absolutely nothing to do. It was originated at Andersonville. It has absolutely nothing to do with a job that that has to be completed and be done. Basically, it was if you went beyond it within the 19 feet of the exterior wall, the Andersonville prison, you were shot dead, and that was Andersonville's deadline. So that's a little story about that. And then Dorrance Atwater, she smuggled out a list of all the prisoners that were there that had died, and then had it published at the New York Tribune. Fortunately for a lot of those families that were able to get this list and that, they knew the fate of their boys and that. I was very lucky that my parents knew what happened to me, and this is a testimony to my memorial to my testimony and stuff like that. So, and that's a little bit about my story.
I heard Haas telling you all about Andersonville, but you can't even imagine the horrors of that place unless you was there like I was. The commandant of Anderson, Henry Wirtz, was the only Confederate officer tried and convicted of war crimes. He was hanged in November of 1865. Wish I'd have been there for that. John Riley here. Have you folks ever heard of a boat called the Sultana? Why, it's the devil's own sick joke, the Sultana was. You see, at the end of the Civil War, the prisoners that had survived Andersonville were mustered out of the army at Vicksburg and were desperate to get home before they dropped dead where they stood. Most of them was ill and looking like a sack of bones. Now the Sultana was a steam-driven paddle wheeler. It had docked at Vicksburg the previous day to repair its boiler and was accepting passengers. It had a capacity of just 376, but on April 27th, 1865, it left with 2,400 men aboard. Well, that boiler should have been replaced because it exploded, sinking the Sultana in the middle of the Mississippi. 1,600 of those 2,400 men had died that day, but most people never learned of the disaster, seeing as how the papers were full of the news that John Wilkes Booth had been assassinated the day before. The Sultana has been dubbed the Titanic of the Mississippi. I was one of the lucky 800 men that survived the Sultana, and I survived Andersonville too. Does that make me the luckiest man on earth or the unluckiest? I believe I'll take my luck and run with it. I made it back home here, unlike Haas and many more recorded here today.
The Beaver Dam Old City Cemetery, and my name is Ned Smith. And I came to Beaver Dam in the very earliest days of Beaver Dam's history in the 1850s. And I was best known for having Beaver Dam's very first oyster bar called the Oyster Depot. And the Oyster Depot, you can see it in the picture right there. See that on the end of the street there? Now that would have been on the south side of the street, on the very end of the street down by Chili John's, facing east back towards where the museum is now today. And I opened up this oyster bar in 1867. And back in the day, there was a big oyster craze in the United States back in the 1880s, which lasted really from about the 1850s up through the 1880s. And then by the 1890s, the oyster craze was pretty much over because they pretty much depleted the oysters out of the Chesapeake Bay, especially in the Atlantic coast. Now, another interesting thing about the oysters is that it actually got its start in the 1700s. In the mid-1700s, oysters were actually considered food of the elite, especially in Europe. But by the 1830s, it had become common for most people to have them. And by 1738, Sinclair Pub in Manchester, England is the world's oldest oyster bar. Now, our bar in Beaver Dam here is not quite that old, but we had a pretty good run for about 2 decades in Beaver Dam. And the oldest oyster bar in the United States is called the Union Oyster House in Boston, which was actually established in 1823. So that's a little bit about my oysters. I have a couple samples here, if you dare to take an oyster. These are Atlantic Coast oysters. Came fresh into Beaver Dam this morning on the train. But I have a better story to tell. You guys want to hear my Beaver Dam fish story? I have a Beaver Dam fish story I can tell you. Now, it was the winter of 1865, right after the Civil War. And back in 1865, Beaver Dam had one of the coldest winters on record. And if you know anything about Beaver Dam Lake is a man-made lake, of course, right? Dammed up in 1841. And it's quite shallow in some places. And because the weather was so cold that year, the lake froze pretty deep down into the ice. Now, we have fish in Beaver Dam Lake, right? And they got to have room to move around and swim and get air, right? Well, it was a tough winter for the fish, and they started to congregate by the many springs that are on the lake, especially on the south side and on the eastern side of the lake. And in 1865, there were 2 gentlemen, Jerome Brown and John Hammond, were out on the ice one afternoon, and they heard a strange strange sound coming from beneath the ice. And they looked down, and it looked like all the fish were congregating in one spot. So they decided to get their axes out, and they dug a hole, and out sprung hundreds of pickerel. Another name for pickerel is the northern pike. And all these pickerel came shooting out of the hole because they had congregated in such a mass under a short body of water. They just sprung out like a leak. Well, people started coming out on the lake and spearing the fish right on the ice and scooping them up. And by the time the afternoon and the evening was over, we had collected 3 tons of fish that were barreled up, put on the train, and shipped down to Milwaukee and Chicago. Now that is a Beaver Dam fish story. That's it. That's
First, let me introduce myself because my gravestone is missing and you can't read it off there. I am Dr. H.J. Kimball, and I myself, along with Doctors Noyes and Winchester, were the early ones. One other doctor, I should not give him Spencer in Manchester, because they were good help to me and we worked well together. Unfortunately, for the first 3 or 4 years here in Beaver Dam, typhoid killed an awful lot of people. Now, I was old school, and I used the bloodletting, and I also used calomel, which was a medication. Both of those went back to actually the time of the Egyptians. Now, besides those other doctors I mentioned, we also had Dr. Ezra Hoyt, he was originally one of the first 49ers, because he went out to California to try to find gold. Don't know if he became rich or what became of him, because we never heard from him again. Now, when I talk about the bloodletting, a lot of people think my apron is dirty from letting the blood out. They had actually changed the way they did bloodletting. And as late as our President Washington, they would actually cut into the veins to get rid of the blood, and they actually took 80 ounces out of President Washington, which was too much, and it killed him. My techniques were much better. I had live leeches that I kept, and I'd put those on different areas of your skin to draw blood out. So I was a much more advanced doctor by using the leeches. Now, we had another doctor, William Smith. He came to town though, and he didn't like the calomel and the leeches. He believed in using the new medicine, quinine. He used quinine. He also believed in prescribing brandy without limit. So his may have worked more effectively than mine, but unfortunately we had an awful lot of drunks, and I think there were a lot of them that went to him. They weren't sick, they just wanted to sort of the modern, hey, see honey, I have to drink this, I'm sick. The doctor ordered it. So, but he was right next to me. He was buried right next to me. Then we said probably a tragic thing happened, and because in 1857 a woman doctor came to town, Dr. Fidelia Harris. Can you believe that? A woman doctor? Women, everyone knows they're good for cooking and sewing and raising children, but she had a certificate for saying that she had gone to med school. And I still to this day, or till the day I died when I was 81, I didn't know how she got that certificate. I have 2 theories. One, her father was the president of the university. 2, her father was the president of the medical school. Or the third reason, he was really, really rich and bought her way into the medical school. Because why else would they let a woman become a doctor? Now, things are just changing so much that, when are people going to go back to the good old cures and go back to the bloodletting? Thank you for coming.